Hello, everyone, and thanks for downloading another Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking again with Brian and Barry Lee about their dad, Zeb Lee, legendary Asheville broadcaster. Let's join in the conversation already in progress with Brian and Barry and Dave Hogan.
Well, I'm Brian Lee with my brother Barry.
Hello.
And we're here to interview Dave Hogan and Randy Houston too, I hope.
I'll be glad to. I'll run the controls over here and keep you guys sounding good.
We're kind of looking at memories from the old radio days from the 60s and 70s and up until the future, I guess, here.
Well, let me say this before I forget it. I loved your dad. He was a wonderful person. And
yeah, we miss him too.
I talked about at this particular time in my life, I was financially having difficulties because, of course, at that time, money, I think I went to work for $80 a week, which is fairly good salary in 1960, I guess. If you compare, I don't know what $80 would be worth today, but it's fairly decent salary. But due to certain circumstances, I was short of money quite often, and I remember going to your dad 2 or 3 times and pleading my case, and can I have an advance on my salary? And you know what he would say? He'd just say, tell Maggie how much you need. Maggie being the bookkeeper, and so Maggie would cut me a check. And he was so generous, and like I said, we had a few arguments about programming mostly, and also Buddy Riesenberg. I hadn't been working there long, and Buddy got into it with your dad. I mean, it was a screaming match. And I thought, what have I got myself into? And your dad looked over at me and winked, and he said, Buddy's blood sugar's low today. Your dad was the kind of person that you could have. I found that later on, because what I saw between Buddy and your dad would have got, a guy fired.
Yeah.
But later on, I learned that you could say what you wanted to your dad. You didn't have to. You hear about open door policies. He really had one, and I really miss later on being able to work for directly with the owner of a radio station. That's rare anymore. Very few stations are owned by a single individual or a single family. We have one in Haywood County, WPTL, which is. We're going to be talking more about that on one of our podcasts, Randy.
Yes, yeah.
They're a locally owned station, but for much of my career after WSKY, I was working for a corporation, and somebody was making decisions in Dallas or Atlanta about most everything at the radio station.
It just got worse and worse after.
Yeah.
Especially the 90s into the
from the 90s on.
Yeah.
I think the success that I had in radio came about because I was a reflection of the people who lived in the Appalachians. I was one of them, and I figured if I liked it, there would be bound to be a lot of other people that would like whatever it was that I was playing on the radio or doing on the radio. But when corporate radio came along and decisions were taken out of the hands of the local station, the local programmers and general managers, I remember when I first went to Johnson City, WJCW, as program director, and, if I wanted to hire somebody, I hired somebody. Mm-hmm. I hired the first female disc jockey in the Tri-Cities area. I didn't have to get permission from the corporate office. Later on, even the general manager of the radio station could not hire a salesman or a sales lady unless they got permission from the headquarters of Cumulus Broadcasting, which owned the station.
And, going back to Zeb Lee and we were working for true broadcasters at that
Exactly.
time. They loved the business.
Mm-hmm.
They were just like us, totally consumed by it from a young age, and had the dog that had caught the car. They got a radio station, and they got to do what they loved to do. And I know for a fact that Zeb Lee loved to talk on the radio. And
Oh, yeah.
he was a broadcaster, loved serving the community.
I remember occasionally I'd ride with Zeb in the car to make a sales call or something. You know, I'd be in the car with him. And I noticed that he would never be listening to the radio station. And I mentioned that to him one time. And he said, well, if I'm listening, it doesn't matter who's working, doesn't matter what's happening, what announcer's on, or what's being said or what's being played, there'll be something that I won't like. And he said, I don't want to spoil my day.
I've been there. I have been there many, many times. Yeah.
He had a great sense of humor, too. I don't know if he showed this at home or not, but he had a great sense of humor.
Oh, yeah.
Some of it dark humor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I remember one time on Sunday morning, a lot of times I slept at the radio station on Church Street.
Really?
Yeah, because we broadcast everything at Breathe back in those days.
Okay.
And I'd be doing the broadcast of the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival from the Asheville City Auditorium on Saturday night, which ended at midnight. And I had to be on the air at 6. And I'd just go to the radio station and I'd sleep in your dad's office. I had me a sleeping bag that I kept stowed away up there.
Okay.
But I went on one Sunday morning, and I didn't have my key. I'd left my key at home. And I happened to remember that, Belk's department store was next door. And there was a little alleyway, a back entrance to Belk's department store.
Right. Now, did that become J. Presley Limited, the
I
men's
think
store?
it did.
Okay.
Yeah, but
That's what I remember.
This is Belk's department store at that time. And I mentioned Robert Martin earlier.
Right.
My black friend, he ran the elevator at Belk's. During the day, they had an elevator. Okay, I go in. I don't have a key. I can't get in. And I remembered your dad always had his window open about yay much. And so I got to thinking, there's a big ladder back there in that alleyway. I guess it belonged to Belk's department store. So I go back there. It's still dark, but I can see enough to figure out how to put that ladder up to the window. And sure enough, the window is open enough for me to push it up and crawl in the window and
do the thing, yeah.
Go on the air and do my program. So the next day I told your dad, I said, Zeb, it probably is not a good idea to leave your window open. And I told him the story. And he said, well, now, if I didn't leave my window open, how the hell would you have gotten in? Well, he always had sometimes a different outlook on things.
He had such a sense of humor that Brian and I, over the last few years, have a collection. We keep this document on Google called Zebisms.
Zebisms.
And every once in a while, we'll come up with we'll remember a new one and add it to the list. But there were some great ones on there.
Can you share one or two?
Oh, well, sure. We could be watching a baseball game, and the batter would connect, and Dad would say, "Goodbye, Dolly Gray," and for years, in other words, it's going to be a home run.
Right.
For years, even after Dad passed, I don't know that he could have, if I'd asked him, if he could have explained the origin of that expression. But thanks to the internet, one day I'm looking around and I decided to type it in, I think on YouTube, and found that it was a song for the, I guess during the Spanish-American War is when it came out, and then it was repurposed during World War it's about, so I guess, soldiers going off to war. So he must have become familiar with it when he was very small during World War One. But it was one of those phrases that you knew was sort of in his arsenal. It was a regular that would come out. Brian, can you think of other favorites?
I'll have to think about it.
One of the
That's a good one, though.
yeah, one of the little tricks that your dad had that I picked up a little later on occasionally. I didn't use it as much as he did because I didn't have the opportunity to. But he'd do this sports show, as we mentioned earlier, at 6 o'clock every night, the sports parade. And oftentimes there would be a, maybe in tennis match, there would be a Frenchman or Frenchwoman or maybe a foreign golfer, or there'd be a name that was not common. And your dad would not know how to pronounce that name. And he would substitute the name of somebody in the community.
Really?
Yeah, he'd substitute.
That's a funny story.
He'd be reading the sports, and let's say it's a baseball game, and he would be talking about how the Yankees beat the Dodgers in the World Series, and a home run was hit by Randy Houston. He'd just pick a name from somebody he knew in the community. And, oh, speaking of baseball, a lot of people who worked at WSKY went on to bigger and better things. Lots of people. Okay, Frank Messer. Have you ever heard the name?
Oh, yeah, voice of the Yankees.
The voice of the Yankees. Frank Messer worked for WSKY. And back in the 50s, I guess maybe the early 50s, because...
He was there 7 years.
Beg your pardon?
Frank was at the station for 7 years.
Is that right?
In the 50s.
And he would come by WSKY. His mother, at that in the time I'm talking about, in the 60s, was still living in Asheville. And he'd come to visit his mother and would come by the radio station. And I've got a Yankee hat I'm wearing today, right there. I became a Yankee fan, Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra and those people, and partly because of Frank Messer. You know, here I know the play-by-play announcer, voice of the New York Yankees.
Maybe that's why Buddy's a big Yankee fan.
Well, there's also another announcer that went on to much greater prominence that I think was at the station in the 1950s.
Wasn't Dave Hogan, was he?
Besides Dave Hogan, it was Bob Kane, who went on to be an anchor at one of the I think first anchors at CNN when it got started.
Okay.
I remember that.
I remember that name. Yeah.
There was a famous promotion that Dad thought up, I suppose. I don't know the origins of it, but I have a picture of. Maybe Brian knows some more of the details, but next door to the station was the Imperial Movie Theater, and Bob Kane was on the marquee throwing money off of the marquee, and there was a huge crowd down below.
Wow.
And you and I talked about Doug
Brooks?
No, went to New Orleans.
Oh yeah, did the all night show on WLW.
WLW worked.
Yeah.
I do remember the name. I'm trying to place the second name, but yeah.
All night trucker. Guy.
Yeah. He was a SKY.
Really, alumni.
Yeah, he worked at WSKY, and he was an embalmer. He had a licensed embalmer, and Zeb would talk about so and so. Back, I wasn't there when
do you know the story of the business that was below the station? So you mentioned embalming.
Go ahead and tell the story.
All right, now Buddy Riesenberg's the one to get to tell this story the best. But at one point, it was a funeral parlor when the building was. So the building's way over 100 years old. It's still there. It's now on Church Street. As you go down Church Street, it's the first building now, the first building on the left. So there was a funeral parlor there. Now there is a story that there was. You know this one?
No, I don't.
All right.
I just anticipate it.
Well, and maybe it was still around when you first came. I think maybe so. So, all right. There was a guy that died, and he was turned out to be quite a character. He had been married 6-7 times. Was always Barry. He was a crook sort of, but he was a con man. That's what I'm trying to say.
Con artist.
He was a con artist par excellence. So he dies, and nobody claims the body, and they don't know how to bury this guy. So for years, they had this embalmed body down there. At this, no, I've checked this out. This story apparently is true. So I don't know what they called him. For years, and they finally did find out who he was. And one of the wives finally did come and claim the body from Baltimore. But in the meantime, when they had a card game going, they had to have an extra. If they didn't have enough people, the guy would sit in on the. So for years we heard about this, and apparently they would sit him up in a corner of the. But somehow he ended up in the radio station above. Now, do you remember anything like that?
No,
Okay.
that's a news story
That's
for me.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Some of the most creative minds in radio, and they're always pulling pranks. And I just love this business. I spent 50-some years in it, and I still love it every day. Stories like that keep coming out.
Randy, we're reminiscing about WSKY, and you mentioned promotions, and brought to mind the fact that after we started playing country music, I, along with a couple other fellows, formed this little company called Meteor Productions, and we started producing country music shows and promoting them at the City Auditorium. At that time is where we had them. And Randy kind of grew up listening to WSKY.
Right.
So since we're talking about memories of the radio station, how about talking about memories of the radio station from the listener standpoint, Randy? You growing up in Madison County and listening to the radio station.
Well, like I told you, I don't think I had this tape recorder rolling here when I told you the story about being at my grandmother's and her listening to you on Sunday morning hymn time, and how I was just a young child, and you had a tremendous following on that show, and you always took the approach of a reverend type attitude on that Sunday morning show. It was.
My daddy was a preacher.
You had the knack. I mean, you really could touch people, and the songs you played, you were always a proponent of local artists and local people who had recorded stuff, and you always made sure it was good. As a matter of fact, you wrote a couple of gospel songs that got recorded by a famous group called Chuckwagon Gang. But you always had such a real approach, and I told you the story about how my grandmother was listening, leaned up on that refrigerator one Sunday morning, and she was crying. She was listening to you and music you were playing, and the tears were flowing. And that, at that very young age, made me realize there's something special about this. And I made a connection to radio right then. And then later on, I was listening to the commercials and the promotion that would go around each country shindig. Country Shindig number 12 presents Conway Twitty and Loretta Lynn this Friday night at the City Auditorium, and I would go. And I watched you be the MC of those shows, and I just couldn't get enough of it. And by the way, later on, after you left Asheville in 77, I took a job at 570 WWNC, and I did afternoon drive playing that country music. And I just stepped right into, in the 80s, the decade of the 80s, as the house MC for the Civic Center. Mm-hmm. And I would introduce these acts, and it was all patterned. My pattern that I went by was Dave Hogan on WSKY. And you guys have brought up some names. There was a piece of material here a few minutes ago that Brian and Barry brought. One name in particular jumped out at me was Dick Bowman. Mm-hmm. Talk about Dick Bowman. What an incredible voice I remember that guy having.
Dick was from down in Kinston, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And how I got to Asheville, I don't recall the details. But I recall one little thing that happened to me when Dick first came to WSKY. I had broadcast maybe a remote during the afternoon. Anyway, I was dead tired. And I lived out in Candler at the time on Pole Creek Road. And I went home to take a nap. That night we were broadcasting the Mountain Dance and Folk Fest. And I went home to take a nap before I went to the auditorium to do that show. Now, I wasn't emceeing the program. We were broadcasting it, but it was sponsored, and we do commercials between the acts. Bascom Lamar Lunsford was the MC and promoter of the old-time mountain music.
I came along and emceed that after you left, yeah.
So, anyway, I went home to take a nap and woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Uh-oh.
Woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Missed the whole thing. Well, I knew, of course, you couldn't get fired if you worked for Zeb. You couldn't get fired.
I think he fired me a time or two. But.
Well, you're an outlier. You're an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
But I was trying to figure out what I was going to say to Zeb the next morning. What happened? Well, Buddy, of course, went and set these shows up.
Right.
And Dick Bowman had just moved to town. And he, as any announcer would do, it's new. He's trying to learn what's going on. And so he just happens to go down to the city auditorium because we're at SKY, we're going to broadcast that show. So he's there, and Buddy's there, and Buddy's saying, well, Dave's not here. What are we going to do? Dave's not here. Dave's not here. Well, long story short, he lets Dick, we've got the commercials there, and he lets Dick do those commercials. So I'm trying to think of what in the world am I going to say to Zeb the next morning when I slept through the whole thing. So I go in, and before I can say a word, he says, you know, that was a good idea you had last night, letting Dick do those commercials, getting him broken in. Thank you.
I love it.
Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you get lucky.
He never knew.
He never knew. I didn't say anything. I didn't say, well, I wasn't there. I just walked away. Your dad was very tolerant of people. A lot of people took advantage of his generosity. And sad to say, during my 17 or so years working for your dad, there were 2 or 3 people who had serious drinking problems that also worked for Zeb during the time I was there.
Yeah, we witnessed it too.
And would they get fired if they missed a few days, didn't show up for work? No. No. They would have gotten fired anywhere else, I'm sure, or most places anyway. Not with Zeb. He understood they had a problem, and he was very tolerant of other people's faults. I love the man.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mic with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.